So we're going to start out with Matt Lachenheiser from the Historical Museum is going to welcome you all here, and then he's going to introduce our first speakers.
Okay, good morning, everybody. I have to say, I think that's the first time that Bill's ever pronounced my last name properly, and I've known him for about 9 years now. So, first and foremost, good morning to everyone, and welcome here to Fort Missoula. Before we begin today, I'd like to do a brief acknowledgement that we are on the homelands of the Salish and the Kalispel people. We offer our respect for their history and culture, and for their wisdom in caring for this place for generations to come. I'd also like to take just a brief moment to thank Bill Weichel and Kim Brigaman for the work they put in to put on this conference today. I've served on a number of different conference committees over the years, and it takes an incredible amount of work behind the scenes to make something like this happen, and for all of us to be here in the room. So if we could, a quick round of applause for Bill and Kim Brigaman. Okay, so as we all know, I'm guessing, how many of you have actually visited some of the museums here at Fort Missoula in the past? A couple? Okay. So I'm going to give you Fort Missoula's history in about 2 minutes or less. Probably won't be 2 minutes, but it's going to be about that. So I want to begin just in the years before the founding of the fort, before white settlement. We know that Salish tribal members utilized many areas in the Missoula Valley, including here at Fort Missoula. Well into the 20th century, tribal members dug bitterroot in the spring, only about a mile from here if you passed the Winco grocery store when you came in at that spot. Bitterroot gathering and hunting in this area was important and significant to our local tribes. Fort Missoula was founded in 1877 as a frontier fort. Unlike most traditional forts back east, it was never a walled fort, and there was never a wall around it. Instead, it relied on the open view sheds that we have here in the Missoula Valley. Today, we celebrate the fort in a variety of different areas, or eras, I should say. The frontier area was from roughly 1877 and during to about 1888, when we go into our Buffalo Soldier era, which was 1888 to about 1905. During the second era, we know that 23 soldiers rode 1,900 miles in 41 days from Fort Missoula to St. Louis, Missouri. And the purpose of this was to test the viability of the bicycle for military service. It would eventually be referred to as the Iron Ride, and the military would decide that maybe the bicycle wasn't the best idea for military service, but I don't think that should diminish the accomplishment of these men taking on this amazing ride. As we get into the 20th century, Fort Missoula was actually nearly decommissioned in the early 20th century before a U.S. senator from here in Missoula by the name of Joseph Dixon went and secured an appropriation from the federal government to reconstruct the majority of Fort Missoula, bringing us into our kind of third era here. And that era, if you notice when you came in, all the mission-style buildings that you see with the red tile roofs, those all relate to that $1 million fort era. So it did earn Fort Missoula that nickname, the $1 Million Post. In the decades following that rebuild, Fort Missoula was used as a military training center during World War I, but again was nearly abandoned by 1921. In 1933, the fort was designated as the Northwest Regional Headquarters of the Civilian Conservation Corps. For about a decade, beginning in 1933, we brought anywhere from 220 to 225 young men for 24 to 32 camps per summer, where they would receive instruction here at Fort Missoula before being sent out to take on a number of the different projects in our national parks, working for organizations like the National Park Service, the Bureau of Reclamation, and the Forest Service. The beginning of World War II marked the end of that CCC era in the camps here at Fort Missoula. I would add just a little quick plug. If you have time this weekend, stop over and visit the Historical Museum at Fort Missoula. We have an amazing new exhibit on the CCC here at Fort Missoula. So during World War II, the fort was transferred to the Department of Immigration and Naturalization Services in 1941, and it was then used as an alien detention center for non-military Italian men. The camp would house over 1,200 Italian internees, and after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, there would be 1,000 Japanese Issei, or first-generation Japanese men, as well as a handful of German resident aliens that would be housed here. Many of the Italians were held for the duration of the war until 1944 when Italy surrendered. The Japanese men at Fort Missoula were put through what are called loyalty hearings, in which they were forced to prove their loyalty to the United States. None of these Japanese men were found guilty of any crimes, and today we recognize that internment was a miscarriage of justice driven by fear-mongering, racism, and a failure of political leadership. The final layer of Missoula's history, or at least as an active fort, was as the U.S. Disciplinary Barracks Northwestern Branch. This camp would utilize the infrastructure from the internment camp and house mostly nonviolent military prisoners. The vast majority of these folks during the late 1940s were convicted of crimes like insubordination, going AWOL. The disciplinary barracks would eventually close in 1947, marking the end of Fort Missoula's role as an active fort, although we do have a presence. The Army Reserve has still remained here and still has a presence at the fort today. And today we have a number of nonprofits that are dedicated towards preservation, education, that are housed here at Fort Missoula. So that's the 2-minute history. I hope it provides you a little bit of context as we gather here today. Again, I'd also like to invite everyone, if you have time this weekend, come over and visit us at the Historical Museum, or our neighbor, the Rocky Mountain Museum of Military History is another excellent site to learn about Fort Missoula's history. So with that, I'm going to transition right in because I know our first speakers are ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and do a brief introduction of our first 2 speakers. So Sadie Peone is the director of the Salish-Qlispe Culture Committee, a department of the Confederate, Salish, and Kootenai tribes. She served the Culture Committee as historical collections manager since 2002. Thompson Smith is the Culture Committee's historian and ethnographer. He served in that capacity since 1991. As they will explain, the Culture Committee's mission, under the guidance and direction of the Elders Cultural Advisory Council, is to educate both tribal members and the public about the culture, language, and history of the Salish and Kalispel people. To that end, the staff has produced books, articles, interpretive signs, museum exhibits, pamphlets, and booklets, web-based materials, films, TV shows, audio materials, and presentations. Sadie and Thompson will present on transportation, transformation, and resistance, Salish-Kalispel perspectives on the Mullan Road and its aftermath. So with that, Sadie and Thompson.
Pesia, good morning. As Matt mentioned, my name is Sadie Peone. Stops. Oh, you can't hear me.
Sadie, can you get really close to that mic?
Okay.
Because we're not hearing you.
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Really close, like that? Is that better? Okay. If I could just take it off.
Actually, for 1 second, you'll notice this whole audience is wearing hearing aids.
Okay, I'll do my best to speak up.
And the rest should be. The rest lie, yes.
The rest lie. Okay. As Matt mentioned, my name is Sadie Peone Stops, and I'm the director for the Selis-Qlispe Culture Committee. And I just want to welcome you all this morning. You all that weren't able to hear me at first, I said Hasquext, Pesia, and that's good morning in our language. I just also wanted to say the Selis-Qlispe Culture Committee is a department within the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes. And again, I want to welcome you to this beautiful place that my ancestors have called for many years Intlai, which is also the place of the little bull trout. My elders would also probably want me to mention to you all that this place also bears the recent name of Selis-Qlispe. And I'm still a very early language learner, so I probably didn't pronounce that quite right. But that translates to place of the killers. So welcome to Place of the Killers. This should give you a little clue that the perspective we'll be offering this morning is a bit different than what some may expect to hear at this conference. For that, you can blame Kim and the rest of the organizers, who were crazy enough to ask us to come to speak to you this morning and to open up the conference as first speakers. We would also like to give a special thanks to Kim and the organizers for inviting us here and inviting our voices to be a part of the conversation. So with that, I'm also going to go into a little bit about the Culture Committee and what our jobs are and what we do within our department. How do I take this off? Can I take this off?
Yeah, sure.
It's so hard to talk into.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, I'm just going to take that off. That's a little easier to talk that way. So the Culture Committee started back in mid-70s, 74, 75. There was a small grant written, and all they knew was that it needed to have some type of cultural component. They weren't quite sure at that point what that was going to look like, what that needed to be. They brought on Johnny Arley, who is in your far right corner, to kind of help with that process to see what that might look like. And he became the first director of the Culture Committee. From there, he began recruiting some other people in the community who were true knowledge keepers, who he identified as people who knew the language very well, knew the culture very well, knew the history very well, and started bringing them together. And so in that past slide, was some of the folks that he brought together. And then over here on the far right is Clarence Woodcock, and he was the second director. And these are some of the elders, the first elders advisory group that he brought together to gather some of our information and stories. And this is a more recent picture of our annual language camp, which we're about to have here in a couple weeks. But just as our program continued started back in the early 70s, we continue to bring that knowledge, those stories, and language forward today with our youth. And so here is a more recent picture of our language camp. This was probably, I want to say, four years ago maybe, because Patalik and Gloria and some of the people who have left us are in this photo, including Tony Nkashola, my predecessor. Our staff is made up of a very small staff. We have Thompson, who is our ethnogeography projects coordinator. We have Shirley Trahan, who is our senior language advisor and translator. We typically have a language program manager, receptionist, maintenance technician, our longhouse caretaker. And we are hoping our staff can expand because we have so much work to do and we have such a need to be able to share what has been gathered over the years with our people. And our primary mission is to preserve, protect, and perpetuate our culture, language, and history of our ancestors, just as Matt mentioned in the introduction. These also are some of the elders that originally came in and started sharing stories. When they came in, when Johnny first gathered them, they were really just sitting around and in a small room like this, sharing stories, and the floodgates kind of opened, and more information came out. There were stories, there were language, there was genealogy, there were place names, there was just so much that they talked about that we rely on so much today. So much of their information that they've shared with us has been shared with them, and they are really the true scholars of our history, language, and culture, and hearing it right from them, from the people who lived it, it can't come from any better resources than that. These are the things that they're able to share with us over the years are not anything we can pick up from a book and just, read from it. And I definitely didn't learn those things in school. But they've truly been amazing to listen to, and everything that we do, all of our materials that we're able to put out and share with the general public, not only with the people, our own people, but with the general public and the broader, across the region, across the world, were able to do because of the painstaking work that, that our senior language advisor and translators have been able to do. This is Felicity McDonald working with Tony Kashola in 2014. This woman worked until she was in her 90s, every single day coming in translating the language, listening to those little cassette tapes and those recordings, because she truly felt like that information needed to be shared with our people. It was a lot of work to do, but it was very thorough work. And because of people like her, we're able to then share that information with the public. And as Matt also mentioned, I spent quite a few years in the historical collections, and these cassette tapes, as you can see there, we've brought them up to, we've also have reel-to-reel, all different types of media, but it's also our responsibility to make sure that these are here for generations to come. So we do our best to make sure that we preserve them in the best way possible and keep them in the, preserved in the best technology that in whatever times we're in. So even these hard drives, that was a few years ago, and we're looking at going to tape now, or even the cloud, because those aren't so reliable anymore. But there's just so much. These collections have been dubbed one of the richest collections in the United States that I know of, just because of the content that's there. We've worked with numerous other archives. Thompson's done an amazing job over the years, how many years? 30 years, 20 years? Probably more years than how old I am. But conducting research alongside our elders, and the information that we have in our collection is just, it's amazing. And like I said, I've heard that from other archives, from other institutions, from other people that I've worked with. Like, there's other tribes that are really struggling to have their content in their people's history and their people's information, their songs, their photos. And some have very, very little, but we're so thankful to be able to have as much as we do. And this is Felicity again, just spending that time going through those cassette tapes day after day, hour after hour. These are my two yayas. These are my grandmothers from my mother's side, Dolly and Shirley. Dolly has since left us, and Shirley is still with us, and she's our senior language advisor and translator, so she's still doing that work with us on the daily. Again, here's another photo of our elders. And all of their portraits are on the wall to honor them in our longhouse. And again, I just want to say that without them and the knowledge that they've been able to share with us, we wouldn't be able to do the incredible work that we're able to do today, and wouldn't be able to share all of our history and information with you all. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Thompson. Thank you.
Thank you, Sadie. I have no shame, so I keep trying to talk Salish, even with a New York accent. But thank you to everybody for being here early on a Saturday morning. To Kim and Bill, again, as Sadie said, for welcoming us here, for Matt for that generous introduction, and to Emma for getting this PowerPoint working. So I'm honored to be here today, so honored, and to have the opportunity to share with you some of the perspectives on this history that we've learned from the elders, the framing of this history that they've provided to us. It's the men and women you see on the screen who, as Sadie said, are the real experts. We're just students, and we'll do our best to pass along to you what has been so generously shared with us. So what we'll be sharing with you this morning, as Sadie was explaining, like everything the Culture Committee produces, does rest first and foremost on these recordings and the ongoing interviews that we continue to do. Kind of have limited space up here. There we go. So, but because of the long, steady existence of the Culture Committee, since the mid-'70s, just 4 directors in all that time, and steady support from the Tribal Council. We've been able to bring all that oral history material into conversation with a tremendous amount of archival research. Basically, the way we kind of think about it is we're finding the information provided by earlier generations of elders. Because even if it comes to us through non-Indian scholars like James Tate, the ethnographer who was on the reservation at the turn of the 20th century, or through the journals of fur trappers or John Mullan or Isaac Stevens or Lewis and Clark, the missionaries, all these things, the information they were getting about tribal history and culture and the place names and all these things, that's provided from earlier generations of elders. And, you know, we recognize those earlier sources come to us with some limitations as well as strengths. The strengths being those are earlier generations, and the problems are they inevitably carry with them the lenses, the cultural lenses of the writers, the errors that can often be introduced in the process of translation and transcription. But as we do with the oral history materials, we just try to sort through those things. You know, and the elders on this slide are from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, all provided incredible information for us. And these elders recorded in the 30s by the anthropologists Claude Schaefer, Paul Antoine Chana, Sophie Moise, Victor Vandenberg, and Ellen Big Sam, and many others. And we've also, as Sadie mentioned, scoured the archives for materials from Lewis and Clark on, and including that guy at the lower left corner there, who I imagine most of you recognize, John Mullan. But again, it ultimately comes back to these recordings. We kind of consider these the gold standard. As Sadie was kind of explaining, the climate of trust and familiarity and the fact that the interviewing and the stories told by the interviewees were all in the language means that material has such a depth of kind of cultural richness, of honesty, of completeness that can be a little bit lacking in some other materials. And our process of kind of corroboration of materials, we go through that as all historians and researchers do, but our process might be kind of the opposite of what's generally done, where many outside researchers will only really take oral history seriously if they're corroborated by the written record. We are, you know, and it's not strictly one direction or the other, but if we had to kind of characterize our process of verification, it's more in the opposite direction. We'll kind of regard that written source as authoritative if it kind of matches up with what we have in some of the recordings from the elders. So in a lot of ways, our mission is to bring forward the elders' stories and to restore some respect for them as the true experts in this stuff, and to bring forward their voices into public spaces. So this is our map of tribal territories produced a few years ago, and I'll kind of get right to the Mullan Road now. And I would say that my sense is that the first thing the elders would want you to know is that the Mullan Road is not really the Mullan Road. How's that? The Mullan Road was built on top of indigenous trails and routes that have been here for thousands of years, that traversed a large section of the map you see there. Even a century ago, 1923, exactly a century ago, historian T.C. Eliot noted, quote, "Speaking broadly, this Mullan Road followed the meanderings of one of the old and well-traveled Indian trails. The road was atop a complex, sophisticated transportation system that connected places known not as St. Regis or Missoula or Bonner or Great Falls. It connected places with names in the Salish language, still used by the people today, that reach back to the earliest beginnings of the human presence in this landscape, in Mesulet, from which we get the English place name Missoula, meaning place of shimmering cold water, in Tlaitststum, place of little bull trout, in Naitststum, place of large bull trout, in Chene, water flowing over a rocky ledge. And I'm not even going to mention the English place names that have been applied to those places, because part of our mission is to restore these older names into our lives. But a couple of things I would just note on this map, because we're going to have to kind of keep hustling along here. In the white lettering on this map are the Salish tribes. And one of the things Sadie's predecessor, our boss for 27 years, Tony Nkashola Sr., always was careful about is that our culture committee only speaks for the history and culture of the Salish and Kalispel people, the Salish and Pend Oreille people. It's for other tribes to tell their stories. And so you'll notice that there aren't the names of any non-Salishan tribes on this map, only tribes in the Salish language family, and by no means not all of them either. And so that's just one thing I wanted to note. Another thing is that something that may be surprising to some people is that the Continental Divide runs roughly down the center of this map. And the last thing I'll just mention is that the place names you see on here are just a scattering few, just to kind of convey the reach and breadth of tribal territories. I think there are, somewhere around 40 on this map. And to date, in the course of the Ethnogeography Project, we've documented somewhere north of 1,500 across those Aboriginal territories. The next thing, and these are the territories map and the timeline are the two things that Tony oftentimes would bring out in public presentations as kind of foundational things in kind of understanding tribal perspectives and tribal relationships with this place. So, as documented in both the oral tradition and in the archaeological record, the Salishan peoples of this region have been here for a very long time. And this timeline kind of is a graphic representation of that. So all of the history, not just since John Mullan, but say since the introduction of horses to the tribes of this part of the world, comprises just that little thin white line at the far right edge of this poster. A version of, so this version of the timeline is up at Bear Tracks Bridge, by the way. It's one of the set of 6 signs we have up there, and we don't have time to go into that today, but just as a point of reference, the oldest of the pyramids in Egypt are something like 6,000 years old. So this timeline reaches back a lot further than that. And that's kind of an amazing thing to really get our heads around. We first created a version of that timeline for this book, a revised edition of which just came out in 2019 through the University of Nebraska Press. And the first edition came out around the bicentennial of Lewis and Clark, and our main point, if we had to boil the whole book down to one sentence, is no, history did not begin in 1805. So the timeline was meant to kind of reinforce that. And indeed, if you took just that timeline reaches back to the end of the last ice age, but say we just confine it to the last 9,000 or 10,000 years, and we boil all that down into a 24-hour day beginning at midnight and ending at midnight. Horses don't arrive until 11:15 p.m. Lewis and Clark, about 11:30 or so. And John Mullan, obviously, a little after that. So it's far from the beginning of the day, more like just about the end of the day, at least the day up to this point in time. Indeed, in the oral tradition, when the elders tell the earliest stories in the wintertime, they begin with the beginning, with the creation stories, the stories of Coyote and the creation and transformation of the world into what we know today. How he prepared the land for the Selis-Qlispe, the human beings yet to come, and how he killed the Selis-Qlispe, the the monsters or literally the people eaters. And he made this place, a safe place, a good place, a place of abundance in all of what the people would need, and showed the people the right way to live. Sometimes by doing the exact wrong thing, coyote being coyote. But those stories are also populated with accounts of a strange and now vanished world, covered in snow and ice, populated by larger versions of the animals we know today, like beaver and buffalo. And you go through those things, the places where they occur in these stories, the descriptions of these, what scientists would call megafauna, and we realize there are just too many coincidences for them to be coincidences in terms of matching up with the geologic accounts of the last ice age. And we realize, amazing as it may be, that these are memories of some of the older parts of tribal history. And it's another piece of why we are kind of on a constant campaign for us to all abandon the term prehistory. There's just history, and some of it's older and some of it's newer. So they've been here a long time. The Salish and Kalispel people have, and they occupied an enormous territory. And these messages, I think, prompt us to ask some uncomfortable questions about why do we call the Mullan Road the Mullan Road? In effect, if not in intention, are we not obscuring or minimizing that long pre-existing complex indigenous transportation network and presence on this landscape? And you don't have to take our word for it, although you should. Mullan himself recorded the Salish landscape that he was traversing. In the course of our ethnogeography project, we draw upon all these various sources, including Mullan's materials, which are rich and amazing, and his maps. This is a part of the kind of Clark Fork River through this area, and a little bit above Missoula, and that's a little zoom in, and you'll see on there what looks like a very strange word, Peone. And what he's trying to represent is the Salish place name for what's today in English called Rock Creek, in Penet, logs in the water. And indeed, we have a sign up there, thanks to a wonderful little partnership with the Five Valleys Land Trust, about that cultural landscape. Here's another one. This is just below Missoula, and zoom in there, and there you can see his attempted representation of the Salish place name Quidlu, meaning red land, and that today is in English called 6 Mile Creek. Here's another one. This is up what's today a name that really sticks in the craw of a lot of Salish and Kalispel elders, the Blackfoot River. It's one they would really dearly love to have renamed. But along what's today called the North Fork of the Blackfoot is Salmon Trout Fork. And the segmentation of rivers in different cultural geographies oftentimes is different. And the North Fork and the main stem of the Blackfoot and actually the Clark Fork down to about the Missoula area, confluence with the Bitterroot, thereabouts, is all known by one place name in Salish, Selis-Qlispe, which means bull trout's waters. And so Mullan was being guided by Salish Kalispel guides at that time, and that's the name that he recorded there. And there's another one of our ethnogeographic signs that we did through a partnership with the Forest Service, and it's up outside the ranger station in Lincoln, just outside of Lincoln. And we have this whole series of ethnogeographic signs, and several of them cover much of what the route traversed by Mullan and where he built his wagon road. This is our place name for the Missoula area that is just filled with so many amazing place names, many of which reach back to the creation stories. But it's a cultural landscape of such richness, and there's no more powerful way to convey that, I think, than by looking deeply into these place names, and that's one reason why the elders themselves made it such a focus of what they related to us. Here is Selis-Qlispe, flint stuck in the ground waters, known in English as the Upper Clark Fork. And in Chilmanet, Bighorn Sheep Waters, what's known as the Lower Clark Fork. So John Mullan also did a great deal to document the beauty and vitality and goodness of Salish-Qlispe life. And indeed, he, like so many other visitors, praised the tribes in the highest terms. In January 1854, for example, he sent a letter to Stevens from Cantonment Stevens, which was near the main winter camp of the Salish, the place known from time immemorial as Kootenai, which means wide cottonwoods, today the location of Stevensville. Of the Salish, Mullan wrote, quote, "I cannot say too much in favor of these noble men. These flatheads have always been, as an Indian tribe, held in the highest estimation, and this I can fully confirm from actual observation. They are," he wrote, "the best Indians in the mountains." Of course, we would agree. Elsewhere, he wrote, "Such nobleness of character, they always treated myself and my parties with a frank generosity and a continuous friendship," and, quote, "their heroism in battle, their good faith towards others, their generally inoffensive conduct have been the theme of praise from both priest and layman," unquote. And some pictures from that same era, some of the oldest pictures of tribal life in the region showing the Kalispel style of canoes. That one's a Curtis photograph, so somewhat later. Mullan's records help bear witness to Salish-Qlispe life here and a way of life profoundly different from the culture and economy that Mullan himself helped introduce. The concept of ways of life, in fact, is something that percolates throughout the stories told to us by the elders. At the heart of their tellings of the history is a clear understanding of the differences between ways of life and of the depth of systemic change that has occurred here in the way that human beings relate to one another and to the land. To grasp the extent of that change, we need to understand tribalism as a way of life, and this is something the elders have really emphasized to us. It is a way of life so deeply intertwined with seasonal cycles of foods and medicines, the shifting abundances of plants and animals, the harvesting of these things with elegant, simple technologies, not so simple in some cases, finely tuned methods for harvesting and storing them, and always a profound spirituality, beginning with the ceremonial welcoming of Bitterroot in springtime. And as these few slides will convey, all of these things still continue. And cultural continuance is, in effect, one of the main ways that Salish and Kalispel people have resisted the kind of changes imposed upon them in their lands, is simply by continuing to practice these beautiful ways of life, and oftentimes in an increasingly hostile environment. So Bitterroot's still welcomed, followed by one of the other main foods, camas, which goes through a complex, incredibly amazing baking process, pit baking process. Still done today. This is a camas baking pit at Language Camp a few years ago. Berries reported in such profusion by so many early visitors, and of course, still very much today. And meat, Salish, known as meat eaters, of course, and buffalo is usually pointed to as the main thing, but many of the early accounts actually emphasize deer and elk and bighorn sheep and many other things, but all of it was important. And one of the things that's understood less well, and this is a lithograph from the Stevens reports that Mullan contributed so much to, one of the things that's been less well understood in many sources is the importance of fishing. Even if it was not the majority of the diet, it played a critical stabilizing role. So when you go through the records of John Mullan or of other earlier visitors, they'll report abundances of deer or of other foods. We see the bitterroot come and go very quickly in the springtime, even though they're an important staple food. And so most of those foods occur in pulses, and they present the Salish and Kalispel people with what some scholars, like the anthropologist Wayne Suttles, have termed coping with abundance, kind of capturing and storing those shifting abundances. But that's why fishing was so important, because unlike those other foods, all those early accounts record waters teeming with fish in virtually every corner of the tribe's territories and almost at every time of year. And indeed, that's one of the reasons why the winter camps were located at places known to have good fishing, ice fishing all through the winter months. So there was that constant, high quality, fresh source of protein that fish provided. And this boy's demonstrating still important. And the whole seasonal cycle also always imbued with spirituality, with ceremony, the biannual trips to the medicine tree then and recently and more recently and continuing on today. So it's not as if John Mullan and Isaac Stevens were the first agents of major change, even if we combine our focus to that last hour of the 24-hour day, from say 11 p.m. forward. Horses were introduced about 11:15 p.m., and we don't have time to dig into these things, but it's just to recognize that there were some enormous changes that happened in the century preceding the arrival of Lewis and Clark. Horses, and then most devastatingly, the introduction of non-native disease, especially smallpox, the impacts of which we're still trying to fully understand, and which arguably communities are still trying to recover from. And when do I have to end this, Kim? What's that? Okay. Well, you have no idea what I got to get through here, buddy. We're gonna be here till 1 o'clock. Okay. Give me like the 5-minute sign when. Okay. So, and the other of those major things kind of introduced in the 1700s before Lewis and Clark's arrival were firearms, which intensified and kind of exacerbated intertribal conflict and helped kind of destabilize intertribal relations. So what Lewis and Clark brought was certainly not the beginning of history, as so many of the Lewis and Clark materials imply, or even the beginning of significant change. But arguably, they did initiate systemic socioeconomic change into the region. And that's because they really opened the way for the fur trade into the Northern Rockies, and with it, a new and alien set of relationships with the animals. Seeing beaver not as beaver, but as money, itself a new phenomenon. In a word, the fur trade brought the first commodification of the natural world here. Soon after, the missionaries began arriving, and that's also a whole nother fascinating part of tribal history we don't have time to go into. Perhaps at least unusual, if not unique, in indigenous histories around the world, the Salish asked for the missionaries to come, and they responded. But there are many complexities in that whole history, and maybe the quickest way to boil it down is that the Salish were looking to add to their spiritual practices and their spiritual universe. The Jesuits arrived with the idea of conversion, and there the two kind of sets of objectives ran into each other. Same with the Upper Kalispel or Ponderay. It was Chief Alexander himself, Thompson, which means no horses, who invited the Jesuits to establish the mission at St. Ignatius. 10 minutes? Oh my God. Okay, you have to talk like an auctioneer, you guys. Then Stevens and Mullan arrive. And at that very same time that the St. Ignatius mission was being established. And incidentally, there's a wonderful sign underneath the bridge at Nchimkane what we know as Paulson, that records an incredible eyewitness observation by Mullan at that spot, where he recounts the Pend Oreille fishing for bull trout and so generously giving some of them to his party. I'm going to kind of skip through some of this about the Hellgate Treaty, the negotiations, the difficulties of translation that are so well recorded there, Jesuit observers saying that not a tenth of what was said was understood by either side, and the shock of tribal leaders at Stevens after a half century of friendship between the Salish and non-Indians, saying, hello, give us all your land, instead of what they expected, which was a peace treaty, a treaty to establish peace between not only with non-Indians, but more importantly with other tribes throughout the region. So other things were understood, including Stevens' demand they all bunch up onto a single reservation, and we know that was understood because that was the main point of contention throughout the negotiations that tribal leaders pushed back against. Clearly, some of the details were not understood, including the boundaries of reservations. This is a map drawn by Sam Resurrection in 1908 of how the boundaries of the reservation were understood by tribal leaders in 1855, and you can see that the northern boundary was way north of Flathead Lake. That contention resulted in Article 11 being added on the last day of negotiations. You can see it in different handwriting there, that set aside the Bitterroot Valley as a reservation for the Salish people. Again, the fine print, not well understood. And that led then to the long conflict over the forced removal of the Salish from the Bitterroot Valley. Chief Charlo, in 1876, said the following, a reflection of the frustration with the aftermath of the Mullan Road, where he said, and these are blunt words, "The white man's course is destruction. He spoils what the Spirit who gave us this country made beautiful and clean. You know that he comes as long as he lives and takes more and more and dirties what he leaves." And he made those remarks at a time when mining operations were exploding across Salish territories. This is a map from 1865 showing gulch diggings and quartz lodes. It's kind of hard to make out there, but they're kind of in red on that thing. And that same year, this came out, which was John Mullan's Guide for Miners and Travelers, published the same year, 1865. So from Lewis and Clark to the fur trade to the missionaries to John Mullan and Isaac Stevens, it's an old and strange story in Salish Kalispel history. Non-Indian friends who tirelessly worked to take tribal resources and annihilate tribal ways of life, even as they described the people and their communities in the highest terms. This disconnect was made possible most of all by their deep assumptions about how the future was something inevitable. They never seemed to stop and ask why, if it's inevitable, did they have to work so hard to make it happen? 2 years before Mullan published this guide, he wrote, quote, "I fear that the location of our road and the swarms of miners and emigrants that must pass here year after year will so militate against the best interests of the mission that its present site will have to be changed or abandoned. This for themselves and the Indians is to be regretted, but I can only regard it as the inevitable result of opening and settling the country." 5, thanks, Bill. So, 3 years before he wrote that, he built the road. And 2 years later, he published the guide that helped spark the gold rush. So on this slide, we can see that from the earliest maps produced by the survey that Stevens conducted on his way west with Mullan in 1853, the railroad was planned to go right through the Flathead Reservation. And yet, there's no mention in the minutes of the negotiations about a railroad, no effort by Stevens to describe one. Indeed, Mullins and Stevens both deliberately hid from tribal people their aggressive vision of dispossession and transformation, even as they freely had expressed it to each other. If anything, Mullan was even more effusive than Stevens in his imperial dreams, and he wrote this in December 1853, looking ahead to the Hellgate Treaty meeting, quote, "One great result obtained from this council and of course the treaty will be the settling of the whole of the eastern portions of Washington and Oregon territories, and thus blot out forever from the map of our country what is now looked upon as the Great Desert, as it were, extending from the Missouri to 100 miles west of the Rocky Mountains, and replace it by one continued belt of thriving settlements and villages where the stir and bustle of business shall resound without cessation." The Mullan Road, in fact, was from the start seen by Mullan and Stevens just as a necessary step toward their real objective, the emplacement of a far more powerful engine of industrial development, one that they knew quite well would transform the region more profoundly, the railroad. The Mullan report in 1863 said, in connection with the proper location and construction of a railroad, one of the most essential aids in advance was practicable wagon road locations, which in time should lend themselves as aids to the construction of our railroad lines. It was not as if tribal people in the region did not see the road as a threat. Many did, and there are scattered glimpses of resistance throughout the Mullan records. So I had a section planned to discuss a lot more about the railroad and the 1882 railroad negotiations, which contain just unbelievable echoes back to the Mullan Road. But we don't really have time for that. But I am going to note a number of highlights. Among them, the resistance of the tribes, which just jump off the page. If you haven't read the minutes of the 1882 railroad negotiations, go find them and read them. They're one of the richest written sources that we know of from the 19th century. And a big portion of it was published in The Last Best Place way back when, in that wonderful book published in the 80s. The document not only jumps with resistance, but also jumps with sarcasm. It's one of the only documents I know of that contains sarcasm. So the Assistant Attorney General of the United States, Joseph McCammon, was the one negotiating with them, with troops from Fort Missoula all around. And McCammon keeps trying to say, hey, we thought you were friends of the white man. We thought you loved the great white father. At one point, Arlee says, yes, we are all good Indians, and we have a nice country, and I don't wish the great father should bother us by a big railroad through the reservation. And then he follows us with one of the fiercest lines of resistance in all the written record. You seem to like your money, and we like our country. It is like our parents. So at that point, McCammon says, well, you can't say no, and you can't negotiate about the price. The tribal leaders tell him, go around the reservation. He says, no, we're not going to do that either. And they say, okay, well, here's another idea. We'll give you that right-of-way in exchange for all that land that was supposed to be part of the reservation from the northern boundary up to the Canadian line. And McCammon tells them, quote, I will report to the great father what you say about the strip of country north. And Chief Michel, the head chief of the Upper Pend Oreille, says, it won't take long. You have a telegraph. McCammon then tells him, don't worry, this land is yours. It's going to stay yours, including this right-of-way. We're just letting the railroad use it. 1912 Supreme Court decision, specifically about the right-of-way through the Flathead Reservation for the Northern Pacific Railroad, that says you relinquished all rights to that. It belongs to the Northern Pacific Railroad. So this kind of thing happens all the time. But the main thing to understand really about the impact, the aftermath of the Mullan Road, is something the elders constantly try to educate us about, which is that for tribal people, especially tribal elders, what we think of as environmental resources are cultural resources. The loss of buffalo, of bull trout, of bitterroot digging grounds is not only a loss of food, it is also a loss of something profoundly important in other ways that are beyond monetary value or quantification. So, you know, we know about the impact of the railroad on buffalo and the unbelievable rapidity with which that happened once the railroad was built into Montana. What we know less of, perhaps, is how the railroad led, just as the elders at that time predicted, directly to the opening of the reservation, to the Flathead Allotment Act, and the breaching of the Hellgate Treaty. So, it looks like I'm out of time, folks. So, I'm happy to discuss more with you later, but thank you so much for giving us your ear this morning. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Is there a possibility that you could make available through Ken some of the transcript of your talk today?
It's possible. I'd have to ask my boss.
Okay, if possible, it would be wonderful.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. And please ask Sadie too. Yes, sir.
You two are speaking about maintaining and sustaining cultural traditions. We're in the middle of fishing, we're in the middle of wheat harvest. Can you tell us what you're doing with fishing and wheat harvest this season? First of all,
Sadie, do you want to?
what roots are you digging and drying? What are you doing with salmon? This is the first year that Indians cannot fish the salmon on the Columbia River. What's that?
Repeat the question.
He's asking, go ahead, Sadie.
He's asking what kind of roots we're harvesting. What kind of roots we're harvesting? Me, my family, myself, my people?
Are you putting on your regalia and your moccasins and
No,
your cuffum and going digging roots?
no. I'll wear what everybody else wears to go dig or to go do their gardening work. So yeah, to continue gathering our foods and medicines. So recently we just had our bitterroot dig and bitterroot ceremony, and that opens up. Primarily there's a ceremony at the beginning in the spring for bitterroot. Once we have that, then that kind of opens up the doors for us to gather all of our roots, berries, foods, and medicines for the year. So we went out, and that also allows numerous other families individually to go out and do that. So each families that want to will go out and do that on their own. So I believe they've done that. Now we'll get into camas or anything else anybody wants to gather as far as foods and medicines. But yeah, we don't disclose all of the foods and medicines, but bitterroot is one primary staple food. Camas is one that'll go through quite a process to bake. And then we'll have food preservation. Those will both last for quite a long time throughout the winter, depending on how much you gather and how you want to use it. And each family is different in how they use foods and medicines, so it really depends on the family. So I hope I've been able to answer your question. As far as the fish, I don't know what the laws are to the west of us for the Columbia River. We do a lot of trading of buffalo and salmon between families and one another with the meat source. So we haven't had a problem trading fish or buffalo with our relatives to the west. So, but I don't know what's going on with the laws there in the Columbia River. So, any other questions?
Separate from that, as I lose more and more hearing, and I see my brothers and sisters with mults behind their ears that electronically allow them to hear. There's a whole lot that can be done architecturally, personally, and digitally to improve hearing, and especially with people spending a lot of time talking with elders. There's a whole lot that can be done. And you can get that. Thank you. Then I can hear you.
Thank you. We'll definitely look into that. That's a really good suggestion. Thank you. Any other questions or comments, suggestions? Yes.
Do you know the trade routes heading west and heading east, were there established meeting places where trading took place between the Salish and the tribes to the west and tribes to the east? Were there known spots?
I think there were several known spots, but I'll let Tom speak to that, because as far as I could recall, or I would say, those things probably still happen today. I actually, in fact, I know that they do. So, but historically, I would say along the river systems, but exact spots, I'll let Tom help answer that question.
Well, I mean, I think that it was mostly just known camps, which were in the same place year after year, maybe shifting around a bit. But when you look down, for example, down the lower Clark Fork, down in Chillimanette place, waters of the Bighorn Sheep, there are so many winter camp locations on down the river, so people knew where to meet with, where to visit each other's camps. In the oral tradition, to my familiarity, there are a few places that were kind of known as intertribal meeting spots, where people would meet to gamble, to trade, to just socialize and meet. One of them is what's today is called Fales Flats up the Nez Perce Fork of the Bitterroot. Another name that the elders would like to have changed since it's Salish territory. But Fales Flats is well up the Nez Perce Fork, and it was called Slice. And the elders have described it as a place where the Salish, the Nez Perce, and off and on the Shoshone, who sometimes were in friendly relations with the Salish and sometimes in conflict, but tribes would meet there. And so there were places that were known for that, but my understanding from the elders is that more commonly it was just wherever they knew the people they were looking for had their winter camps or camps at other times of year. Ashe.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Yes, I do.
And so if anybody else has any questions from Thompson, I think you're going to be a bit here.
I am. I'll stick around.
So you go to the back or something.
Okay.
Go back and quietly ask him, and we'll move on to the rest of our conference.
Okay.
Appreciate you guys.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill. So, our boss, Tony Sr., used to call me Columbo because I always had one more thing. So I got one more thing. One of the best histories of the railroads, if you're interested, is by the great environmental historian Richard White, called Railroaded. Came out about 10, 12 years ago. And in that book, he has one of the great articulations of what he calls contingency. And here's what he says. It's short. The deep common ground of good history is that things did not have to be this way. To say that choices are not limitless, that we always act within constraints imposed by the past, is not the same thing as saying that there were or are no choices. The past contained larger possibilities, and part of the historian's job is to make those possibilities visible. To me, that's exactly what the elders are telling us. Okay, thanks.